Episode 16, Chapter 15, The Fault in Her Stars. Chapter 15, The Fault in Her Stars. It was the kind of piercing roar that hadn't been heard since the night this had all begun, when the shrubs and stars had screamed themselves into oblivion together. The sound of it rumbled through the palace like guttural thunder, echoing in time with the pulses and quakes of the spire above. Whatever pre-liftoff procedures had been happening inside the colossal ship, they seemed to be entering their final phase. Its neon-webbed hull flared brighter, and the pitch of its alarms grew steadily shriller, as if something within the ancient dreadnought had been awoken by its mistress' long-forgotten call. Down, down, in the ruined chambers at the tower's base, the four heroes held their ground as the chaos finally began to subside. Their enemy loomed ahead and stretched her tendrils to the sides, the totality of her form so massive that she threatened to engulf them all. Vivian didn't know what it felt like to have knees, but if she had them right now, in this thing's presence, she was sure they'd be trembling.
"Is this the Empress' true form?"
she asked herself, watching her pitiful flames dance within the creature's blazing eyes. She had braced herself for all kinds of terrible things, but not for the Empress to literally explode into the hugest monster that the siren had ever seen. This new beast was larger than Gloomtail, had more tentacles than the Smorg, and held enough hate in its eyes to unsettle the Shadow Queen herself. Vivian had never seen a shrub with her own eyes before. Back home, the aliens had been nothing but a bitter memory by the time she had come along. She had heard plenty of stories, though, especially in this timeline, where the invasion had been so much worse.
"I've never seen a shrub, but I can recognize one, and there's nothing else she could be."
It was an easy puzzle to solve, although it left her with even more questions. She'd get her answers soon, but not before the Empress scattered the party with a cheap and sudden first strike. She swung her hyphae down in unison, slamming the floor so hard that the stone tiles splintered apart beneath the impact. As the heroes struggled to avoid the shockwaves, the monster lashed her tendrils sideways, sweeping them across the floor until they crashed through the piles of furniture that lay forgotten against the outer wall. Vivian felt Mario grab her hand and pull her out of range, over to the corner where Luigi had already been trying to hide himself away. The hyphae swept from side to side, pounding the walls over and over again, until the expanse between good and evil had become an impassable field of death. Only then, with the battle formation utterly broken, did the Empress choose to resume the tale of her past.
"My home world was dying. Please, for stars' sake, not so loud," Bao interrupted, waving her stubby arms frantically as the sound waves buffeted her weightless body. "If you absolutely have to start monologuing, can you at least try to keep it at a sensible volume?"
"I actually kind of agree," Vivian put in, earning an appreciative nod from her ghostly friend. Mario and Luigi seemed confused, and the Empress narrowed her eyes in something like disgust, but the siren knew what she was talking about.
"Sometimes, if somebody talks too loudly, it gets hard to understand what they're saying. All the words just sort of blur together into a mess."
The beastly shrub regarded the two women for a long time, hissing beneath her breath with all the subtlety of a forest fire. When she finally started speaking again, her voice was much quieter, although no less filled with malice.
"The planet itself was withering away, rotting with a plague that had no cure. My people took to the cosmos, to find a new home before it was too late."
Sadly, the Empress wasn't content to sit back and idly tell her story. With every sentence, she surged ahead and lashed at her foes, forcing the heroes to separate and focus on dodging in whatever way they could.
"My two precious daughters led one of the fleets themselves. They were too willful and independent to stay at home, but too close to ever dream of splitting up."
Vivian threw herself to the side as a fungal tentacle struck the floor where she had been standing, further cracking the stone beneath her.
This is the world their search led them to. Lush, organic, and filled with vim for us to feed upon.
The siren readied a fireball, hurling it at the appendage as it began to pull away. It sizzled on impact, but barely left a mark, and the Empress didn't even seem to notice. Up above, Mario leapt from limb to limb in an acrobatic dash for the creature's head, but an unexpected swat from the side sent him right back down to the floor where he had started. The Empress was still narrating, her words punctuated by the sizzling and crackling of her alien accent.
It was a perfect home for the shrubs, but the natives wouldn't let us colonize in peace. My princesses nearly won the war, but in the end they were driven away.
More tendrils filled the air, and Vivian found herself backing away until she stood beside the brothers again.
Only the younger, so delicate and pure, made it safely home to me. Her sister, my eldest, died bravely in the fighting. That explains why we never had to deal with Mama Shrub in our timeline,
Mario whispered to his brother, before turning to Vivian with a hasty elaboration.
Neither of the princesses survived, so there was nobody to go back and tell the Empress how to find us.
She was probably still out there somewhere, trapped on her dying planet and wondering what had become of her family. In spite of everything, the thought made Vivian feel a bit empty inside.
I came to this world myself,
the Empress continued, paying no heed to the little conversation happening across the room,
with the full might of the Imperial fleet at my back. There was no way those wretched toads could stand against us. Our victory was guaranteed.
In a sudden fury, she slammed all her hyphae into the walls at once, as if trying to bring the ceiling down and flatten everyone in the room.
Until the night a strange energy signature led us all to Shooting Star Summit.
Vivian stopped listening for the moment, focusing instead on the bits of debris that were starting to sprinkle down from above. This part of the story was easy enough to figure out, and part of her felt like she had heard it somewhere before.
This isn't the kind of fight we should be having indoors,
she thought, watching as crystals fell from the overhead chandeliers and shattered against the floor like hailstones. Mercifully, the Empress seemed to rethink her strategy at just the right moment, coiling herself back into a smaller form.
After the battle ended, I awoke in the body of a broken child.
Slowly, liquidly, she pulled herself upwards, grappling between the two chandeliers until she was hanging from the ceiling like some grotesquely misshapen spider.
I'm still unsure how my spirit found that vessel, but the wizard never seemed to suspect that his little princess was gone. I could still feel her, you know,
she continued, giving her bulbous head a ponderous shake.
A pale echo, crying in my mind and driving me to hysteria. I haven't had a moment's peace in my own thoughts for over 20 years.
She effortlessly snapped the chains of the hanging lamps, holding them in her tendrils like an ominous pair of crystal flails.
I've wanted to purge her so badly. You have no idea how often I thought about doing something drastic.
In an instant, she whipped her tentacles backwards beneath her, sweeping the chandeliers down until they erupted against the floor in an explosion of glass and gold. Bao vanished just as the shards sprayed through her, and Vivian grabbed onto the brothers before plunging into the safety of her shadow veil. But the shadows weren't exactly hers right now, which she remembered too late as that awful choking sensation overtook her again. She could feel Mario kicking at something in the darkness, just before the echoing laughter kicked in, and Vivian found herself staring into a manic reflection of her own eyes.
Did you forget about me, down here by my lonesome? Unluckily for you, I don't really feel like having company.
Before she knew it, the siren was being forced back up into the physical world, sputtering for air with Mario and Luigi by her side. Nobody was hurt, and the crystal blast had thankfully settled by now, but the lesson was clear: the shadows were off limits until this nightmare battle was over. High above, the Empress rumbled with disappointment as the heroes emerged unscathed.
I suppose that's all in the past,
she concluded, stretching herself out over the newly empty expanse of ceiling where the lights had been attached.
When the transference ritual failed, my true form was restored. It's not what I wanted, because the army I built here will never follow me like this.
Even from far away, it was easy to see the flash of epiphany in the beast's inferno eyes.
But I don't need their help to escape this world. I can fly the ship by myself, all I need to do is reach the bridge.
She sagged off the ceiling a bit, letting herself hang as a purplish haze began to spill from her, billowing out of some unseen alien orifice.
I'm tired of watching you all hop around me like fleas. Hurry up and die, so I can put this life behind me at last.
Luigi immediately jumped back about 6 feet, while Mario hurriedly inhaled, then covered his nose and mouth with an arm. Evidently, the two of them had seen this type of gaseous attack before.
Whatever you do, don't breathe that stuff. Those clouds are pure poison.
Mario warned, the words coming out half muffled by his sleeve.
We've gotta make her stop, before it fills up the entire room.
That gave Vivian a crazy idea, although she wasn't even slightly sure if it would work. She recalled one of Admiral Bobbery's old fish stories, about how he had cleared the toxic fog around Goop Blue Lagoon with a single well-aimed spark. Supposedly it had been ultra-flammable, but Vivian had no idea if this kind of poison gas worked the same way. She decided that it was worth a try, at least. Taking a deep breath of her own, she let a fireball come alive between her fingers as she glided out past the front of the group, sprinting to the very edge of the clear air. With the kind of battle cry she hadn't quite thought herself capable of, she pitched the flaming fastball as hard as she could across the room, watched it soar straight into the thick of the Empress cloud, and fell back onto her butt, half blinded, as the resulting explosion tore the chamber apart. Her idea hadn't just worked. It had spawned a hellstorm, and by the time her fears and reasoning had caught up with her actions, it was too late to do anything but watch. The Empress and her shrieks were lost inside the blast, as the burning fumes fused into a curtain of fire that reached ravenously from wall to wall.
Gee, I think I may have overdone it just a little.
The next thing she knew, Mario was at her side, helping her back upright and leading her away from the flames, over to where Luigi and Bao were whooping and hollering in celebration. Mario himself seemed quietly impressed, but there was a tinge of worry in his voice as he met her unfocused eyes.
Are you all right? That was one heck of a gamble you just made, Viv.
She answered with a nod, squinting to try and clear away the spots in her vision. In spite of the retroactive anxiety, she was a tiny bit proud of herself for pulling off something crazy enough to shock even Mario.
I feel fine,
she said with a small smile, which seemed to be enough to make the hero relax.
Sorry if I almost blew us up. It seemed like a neat thing to try at the time.
Empress Shroob, meanwhile, was far less impressed by Vivian's little stunt. Her crimson gaze flared back to life behind the clearing smoke, her tendrils flailing madly in silhouette as the monster pulled herself out of the heap she had crumpled into.
Gyaaaagh. Enough of this!
She roared, all pretense of volume control forgotten.
The night is waning, and I have no more time for you.
With that, the great beast propelled herself backward, dragging her tentacles through the piles of now burning furniture as she went. By the time she reached the rear windows, the Empress had amassed a full arsenal of charred tables and burning chairs, which she hurled across the room with all her might, before hauling her massive form up through the windows and out of sight. Vivian instinctively tried to fall into the shadows, but met with her duplicate's resistance immediately. She was forced to dodge the projectiles instead, weaving around flying silverware and the melty remains of an uneaten layer cake. At the same time, Mario was hurtling the fiery debris, while Luigi managed to catch a decorative flower vase right out of the air, looking mildly surprised by his own reflexes. Bao had simply phased through it all, and was already halfway across the hall by the time she decided to look back.
"This is no time to be playing around,"
she urged, watching in exasperation as the others evaded serious injury.
"Didn't you hear what that evil thing said? She's going to try and launch the ship."
The siren's eyes widened in horror as she realized the full implications of letting the Empress get away.
"She wants to invade our world, right? But they have no idea what's coming for them."
She remembered what Mario had said about the STAR, and how it had erased Mushroom City in a matter of minutes.
"If this ship gets through, then it's game over for everyone back home."
By the time the party reached the far wall, they were just in time to see their enemy's backside slithering up through the ceiling of the vast chamber beyond. The dining hall's front windows had looked out over small courtyards that were open to the sky, but this new plaza seemed to be situated underneath the spire itself. Massive beyond measure, this was clearly the interior of the stadium that the building had resembled from outside. Panicked guards were running to the center of the chamber, pointing and staring skyward at the immense beast that had just burst across their paths. Overhead, the roof of the stadium sloped upwards like a funnel, opening into a shaft that blazed with violet light, the yawning throat of the dreadnought itself. The Empress roars echoed down from within, and every so often a flailing soldier would fall through the opening, helpless as they plummeted toward the increasingly horrified throng below. Mario and Luigi vaulted through the window, landing on a metal catwalk that passed several feet beneath. Vivian followed a few steps behind them, being careful not to scrape her shadowy tail on the glass shards that stuck up from the sill. The siren noticed that Luigi was still carrying his little vase, and wondered if he had simply forgotten to drop it in the heat of the moment. Now that she was outside, Vivian had a much better view of this strange new metallic cavern. The bridge they were on wound around the chamber in a sweeping corkscrew, hugging the walls before ending at a landing just inside the tunnel's gaping mouth. Presumably, that shaft was the spaceship's main entrance, and the only one large enough to be used by a shroom of the Empress size. Unfortunately, the heroes had barely started their ascent before a knot of shadowy hands sprang up to bar the way. The brothers skidded to a halt just before the grasping fingers could snag them, and Vivian watched as her alternate self emerged from hiding further up the slope.
"This is as far as you go,"
the twisted siren yelled down, an unhinged fury in her eyes.
"There's no way I'm letting you stop this launch."
Mario groaned and threw up his hands in irritation, hopping from side to side as if he could juke his way past the blockade.
"Why are you trying to stop us this time? How could you still want to serve the Empress, after seeing what she really is?"
He made a leap of faith over the cluster of hands, only to be greeted by another that had burst up just ahead of him, trapping the hero in between.
"That's the entire point, silly,"
the faux Vivian mocked, gliding forward to cup Mario's cheek in a way that made the real Vivian seethe.
"I've seen what she is, so why would I want her in my world anymore? If she wants to escape, then I'll do my best to let her."
Her affectionate gesture became a slash, making Mario wince as she raked her fingers across his face like claws.
"She'll be your world's problem to deal with from now on."
Suddenly, the shadowy mass turned inwards, the hands burying themselves in the catwalk as they ripped and tore away at the metal itself. All along the path ahead, shadows emerged from the walls in rippling waves, tearing at the floor until it buckled, and then dragging the bits back with them into the void. Before long, what had been a stable bridge was transformed into the kind of eighth world death course that nightmares were made of. The Mario Bros. Set off immediately, running with the kind of sure-footedness that came from years of experience. Bao, of course, merely floated along beside them without a worry in the world. But Vivian was much less sure of her platforming skills. she crept to the edge of the nearest gap and tried to gauge its height, but her efforts only left her with a nasty rush of vertigo. Being a shadow siren, she couldn't exactly, well, jump. Her tail was a tether that kept her rooted to the nearest surface, and although it was stretchy enough to let her cross some gaps, there were definite limits. If she tried to glide out over the edge of a pit that was too deep, then she would surely come unbound, and that meant she would fall. Vivian remembered the first time that she had felt her tether outright snap. The day that she and her friends had been fired out of the Bob OMB's awful moon cannon. Being separated from the shadows, even for those short few minutes of flight, had been enough to leave her feeling queasy and irritable for the rest of the afternoon. She never, ever wanted to feel like that again, which meant that she needed to be incredibly careful in situations like this. Easing up to the edge of the abyss, Vivian pressed her back against the wall and tried to shift her point of contact up onto the vertical surface. It didn't feel right, and she had to hold onto the railing to keep herself steady, but with a little determination, she was able to swing herself up and over the gap.
There, see? That was easy. I could totally cut it as a platformer heroine.
Sadly, her celebration was cut short when she looked back up the path, and saw just how far she still needed to go. Mario and the others were coming back around on the next level up, having nearly lapped her already. Her duplicate had retreated to the faraway landing, where she had begun spawning shadowy globs that rolled and tumbled down the pathway like barrels made of fog. Vivian kept climbing, keeping her pace steady and never doubting that she would reach the end eventually. By the time she had finished her first lap, her friends were entering their last, and their foe seemed to be getting anxious as the space between them grew smaller. She changed tactics with an echoing giggle, flipping a nearby switch and waving goodbye as the spaceship's entry hatch began to close. Alarms blared from on high as the steel barrier slid into view, eclipsing the tunnel's light and threatening to leave the stadium stranded in total darkness. Vivian paused to catch her breath, accepting that she had never beat the stage with such a strict time limit in play. She decided to cheer for Mario instead, who had doubled his own pace and now seemed poised to cross the final divide with a stylishly executed long jump. As he made the leap, Vivian paid close attention to the hazards in her soaring hero's way. The shadowy hands were flailing everywhere, trying to snatch him right out of the air, but their reach was limited, and the enemy siren didn't seem to have any other tricks to use. There was something very strange about this situation, and Vivian's misgivings were slowly brewing into an idea.
Why hasn't she thrown any fireballs yet?
She wondered, watching her other self back away warily as Mario stuck his landing. If Vivian were the one up there, trying to keep a pursuer at bay, then she would be taking pot shots with Shade Fist at every chance she got.
Come to think of it, I've never seen her make fire at all. If she's another version of me, then why do we have different powers?
Her eyes lit up in a sudden flare of revelation.
Wait, what if she never even...
In a flash, Vivian dove into the shadows and set off like a torpedo, too invested in her theory to care about the risks. Luckily, her duplicate was too preoccupied at the moment to fight back, and Vivian met little resistance as she streaked up and around the corkscrew, back in her element at last. She blurred past Luigi and Bao, banked up and around the last big gap, and managed to intercept Mario and the villainess just as their battle was about to begin.
You can't do it, can you?
She blurted as she burst back to the surface, earning baffled glances from the two combatants she had just interrupted. She spotted a flicker of uncertainty in the other siren's eyes, so she decided to press the issue a little bit further.
You're scared of bright lights, so you never bothered to learn about your own fire powers, did you?
Her counterpart looked horrified for half an instant, before hastily throwing up the mask of a sneer.
Are you trying to say that you're better than me? You're the weaker one. You latched onto your little flames, and they're all you ever learned.
Shadows clawed at the edges of the arena, 1,000 arms making their silent presence known.
These are the powers you could have had, if you had stayed in the darkness where you belonged.
Ignoring the taunt, Vivian set her hand ablaze and waved it in front of her, watching as her enemy involuntarily flinched away from the glow. The little detail wasn't missed by Mario, who raised a surprised eyebrow as the scene unfolded.
See, it scares her. That's how we can win.
Vivian insisted, gliding back a step to stand beside her partner.
But, I'll probably have to take the lead, since we don't have any fire flowers you can use.
Which is when Luigi appeared, slightly out of breath, managing to cross the threshold just as the great steel panel slid shut behind him.
You mean like these?
He offered, holding up the vase he had been carrying all this way, and for the first time, Vivian noticed what the bright orange flowers inside it really were.
I grabbed these in case we needed to stop more poison clouds, but I guess we can use them here instead.
Mario broke into a grin and pulled his brother into a hug, which might have been a subtle way of inviting him into the battle.
You're a genius, Luigi. This is just what we needed.
Vivian looked on in concern as they each plucked a flower from the bouquet, shared a brief glance of resolve, and shoved the leafy power-ups into their mouths. As soon as the brothers began to chew, the flower's magical essence swept through them like wildfire. In a split second, their auras surged with such intense warmth that every cool color seemed to vanish from their bodies, tinting their blue overalls pure white. They fell into fighting stance side by side, flame-charged, and stronger than ever. The heroic moment was only slightly ruined when Luigi stuck out his tongue and shivered in disgust.
The taste never gets any better, does it, bro?
Mario offered a third flower to Lady Bow, who hesitated slightly before taking it from him. She turned it over a few times, as if examining every petal, before politely turning down the opportunity.
Thank you, but I think I'll pass,
she said, threading the plant through one of her hair bows and giving it a little shake.
These flowers accessorize nicely, but judging by poor Luigi's face, I'm not sure I'd like to snack on one just yet.
The hero nodded respectfully, then turned back to glare at the enemy, who was suddenly looking like she'd rather be anywhere other than here.
This is for all the nasty tricks you've played,
he told her, embers dancing through his fingers as battle plans played out behind his eyes.
Luigi, let's finish this with a good old-fashioned bros attack.
And so the offensive began. The supercharged brothers threw fireballs rapidly, letting the projectiles land where they may and transforming the battlefield into a roaring sea of flame. Vivian chose to occupy the shadows, flitting about beneath her counterpart and keeping the escape routes blocked. Between the three of them, it didn't take long until their foe was utterly trapped, surrounded on all sides by the light that terrified her so much. Looking up from below, Vivian's position gave her a view of the battlefield that nobody else had. She could see far up the shaft, to where the Empress was still tearing her way towards the bridge. Bits of the ship were raining down, torn loose by the writhing monster, falling into the blaze and scattering embers like a fireworks display. She watched Mario and Luigi place their hands together, fusing their next attack into the kind of finishing nova that would leave only ashes behind. But most of all, she could see how lost her other self looked, and it nearly broke her heart. The foe siren's eyes were squeezed shut, and her breath came in shallow gasps as she pressed herself into the last safe corner, trying to make herself as small as she could be. In that moment, Vivian didn't see her psycho double from another world. She saw herself having the same kind of panic attack that had ruled and ruined her life for so long.
Deep down, she's just like I was, back before.
And then a lot of things happened at once, snapping Vivian from her thoughts before she even had a chance to finish them. A great silver chunk of bulkhead fell from the shaft, striking the battlefield like a thunderbolt and kicking up the debris that had fallen so harmlessly before. A bit of it struck Mario in the back, knocking him to the floor with a grunt as his fiery aura flickered out. Luigi ran to his side without hesitation, letting their perfect combo fizzle away to nothing. Their enemy seized the opening as soon as it appeared, her face shifting back to a slasher smile in the time it took Vivian to blink. Shadow arms whipped up through the dying flames, snaring the heroes like a lunchfish gulping prey from the surface of a lake. It happened so suddenly that even Bao was caught off guard, and she was yanked into the darkness before she could think to disappear. The near victory was turned on its head, and now the whole party was floundering in the abyss. An instant later, the hazy tendrils were pulling the three in separate directions, dragging them harshly off into the blackness of the void. Without even thinking, Vivian plunged into the swarm of hands and sped off after Mario, reaching out for him as she tried to avoid being grabbed herself.
Don't worry, I'm right here,"
she called, racing hard to match the speed of her own duplicate's attack.
"I've got you, I promise. Just try to grab my hand."
When her fingers finally met his, she swung her other arm forward to blast fire at his ankles, searing away the tendrils there and pulling her hero to freedom. Safely back in each other's arms, the two of them glanced around for their missing friends, but Luigi and Bao were nowhere to be seen, already lost in the fog of the abyss. Even their screams had faded out, replaced with the soft laughter of their approaching foe. Mario would likely insist on staying to find his brother, but the pressure was building, and it was already getting difficult for Vivian to breathe. She made a split-second decision, turning upwards and swimming for the surface with all the strength she could muster. Whatever became of the others, Vivian only knew that she had to save Mario, and that they both needed to get out of the shadows now. Her vision was fading fast, but the spire was looming just ahead. One last push, and then they'd be safe again.
"I know that I can make it. For both of us. If I can only... just..."
The very next thing Mario knew, he was being ejected from the shadows into the hearty embrace of a solid metal floor. Of course, the numbness left his extremities just in time for him to get the full impact experience. He coughed a few times as he sat back up, still trying to puzzle out what in the world had just happened. Their enemy had been on the ropes, one good blast away from either surrender or the underwear, a place where she'd never be able to hurt his friends again. But that had all changed in the madness of a single moment. The party was in shambles again, and he had lost sight of Luigi for the second time tonight. But before he could worry about the others, he needed to figure out where he had ended up himself. Hopping to his feet, Mario tried to take in the utter enormity of the chamber that surrounded him. It seemed to be some kind of aircraft hangar for the shroop saucers, because there were thousands of the vile things lining the walls. They were stacked row upon row, each attached to their own little docking platform, charged with stardust and ready for takeoff. This bay was obviously inside the mothership, because it suffered from the same neon sci-fi aesthetic that Mario had seen in the entryway. Arteries of bright magenta streaked across every steel-plated surface, crisscrossed with occasional veins of yellow starlight. The farthest wall was home to a truly immense doorway, wide enough to let saucers fly in and out by the hundreds at a time. It had been shut in preparation for the launch, but Mario had no doubt that it would be open again soon, as this new fleet spilled out into the skies of his own world. The room's lighting was so harsh and purple that he nearly missed Vivian, who had been sprawled beside him the entire time. He jumped a bit when she gasped herself awake, but he knelt down to support her as she fell into a coughing fit.
"Hey now, Viv, it's okay. You did it. you got us out of there,"
he whispered, rubbing her back in small circles until the spell had passed.
"What happened down there, anyway? How is she able to do all of that crazy stuff? The last time I saw attacks like that, it was when we were fighting." "Well..."
She sat up to face him, bravely finishing the sentence that he had chosen to abandon.
"The Shadow Queen, right? It's pretty spooky, and the truth is, I don't know how she did any of those things."
Her courage faltered, and she shook her head until her eyes vanished behind her bangs.
I am so sorry, Mario. I know you want to go find Luigi, but I just can't take you back in the shadows. When evil me is nearby, I can't be down there without choking, or feeling like I'm about to pass out."
As worried as Mario was, he knew that he needed to have faith in his little brother. Luigi wasn't helpless, after all. He hated scary situations, but he could handle himself if he was thrust into one.
"I'm sure he and Lady Bao are fine, but we still need to get them back. This is a bit too much for Vivian and I to handle by ourselves."
He stood back up, and then held out a hand for the siren to join him. Once she was back at eye level, he pushed aside the mess she had made of her hair, and met her gaze squarely with his own.
"If evil you is screwing up the shadows, then we'll make her stop together. Then we can find Luigi and Bao."
It sounded like such a simple plan, until he started remembering their other dire objectives.
"Of course, we also have to stop the Empress from launching the ship, and Princess Peach still needs rescuing."
Suddenly, nothing about the situation seemed very simple at all.
"Mamma mia, this sure is escalating quickly."
He must have tempted fate, because that's when a side door opened and a full platoon of soldiers charged into view, barreling towards Mario and Vivian with their weapons drawn. The two heroes braced for battle, only to be left in the dust, utterly bewildered, as the guards trundled right on by. Mario stepped into the path of a straggler, but the soldier seemed more distressed at being slowed down than at finding an intruder.
Stand aside. Haven't you heard? There's a giant monster attacking the tower. We must defend it and protect the Empress."
Perhaps this was a bit of good fortune after all. Mario stepped closer, deciding to test his limits just a little bit more.
"We're not supposed to be in here,"
he reminded, indicating himself and the shadowy girl beside him.
"Aren't you going to attack us, or try to throw us in the dungeons?"
The guard just seemed anxious to get moving, bouncing on the balls of his feet as if he were waiting in a bathroom line.
"Whatever, man. Hoodlums like you sneak into restricted areas all the time."
He finally pushed his way past, dashing into the darkness to try and catch up with his comrades.
"I've got bigger things to deal with, like keeping my Empress safe."
Vivian watched him leave, her expression torn halfway between amusement and guilt.
Should we tell them?"
she asked, peering down the hallway into which the guards had vanished.
"I mean, they'll be attacking the same person they want to protect, even if they don't know it."
Mario shook his head, seeing the flaws in such open honesty.
"If Empress Shroop's army wants to turn on her, then that's good for us. They might finally accomplish something useful."
Even so, he started walking towards the hallway, beckoning for Vivian to follow.
"Maybe we should go after them, though. They'll know the quickest route to wherever the battle is happening."
Alas, he had barely finished speaking when their own special problem found them again. Mario felt the whoosh of heat just in time to dive aside, watching in horror as a meteor struck the spot where he had just been standing. It splintered apart on impact, spraying cinders in every direction, and it wasn't until the fires dimmed that Mario recognized the ashen remains of a dining chair. Standing up yet again, he joined Vivian in turning to see where the attack had come from. It wasn't hard at all to find the source. Across the room, a legion of shadowy arms was snaking into view, rising from the depths with their fists clenched and burning. Each of them held some hellish new projectile. Bundles of fiery wood and blazing wads of tablecloth, gathered from the inferno in the feast hall far below.
"Do you still think you're better than me?"
the other Vivian asked, emerging slowly from the shadows as she weaved through her battery of makeshift fireballs. Her eyes were bloodshot and absolutely predatory. As she broke into a grin, it was plain to see that she had finally snapped.
"I may not be able to make fire, but I'm just as good as you at throwing it."
As if to prove it, a few hands wound back like catapults, releasing as one and launching a fresh salvo of burning junk through the air. Mario and Vivian split up as the meteors crashed around them, exploding into shards and lingering clouds of ash. The projectiles kept on falling, the battlefield getting more chaotic even as the thickening air made it harder to see and breathe. The hero jumped and tumbled through the fiery fog, trying to pinpoint his enemy by the sound of her laughter, but the echoing sighs of the bay made that all but impossible.
"Why are you running?"
the siren's voice called, lilting like a song and bouncing off the walls in every direction.
"I thought you guys were all about fire?" "Ooh, maybe you're just upset that I've mastered your little trick, and proven what fakers you really are."
Mario felt another rush of heat, crouching down just in time to avoid the flaming table leg that whipped by overhead. He finally met back up with Vivian, and the two of them ducked for cover behind a pile of saucer scraps in a nearby assembly area.
"What are we going to do?"
she asked, wincing slightly at the sound of each new explosion in the background.
"If we try to run, she'll just use the shadows to find us again. How can we stop her if she's connected to the entire ship?"
Mario had been trying to think of ideas on his own, with very little success. But something Vivian said lit a spark of inspiration, and what happened next blew that spark into a plan. The mothership heaved as the engines flared again, sending a subtle kinetic ripple down the rows of saucers that hung above the battlefield. Mario followed the movement with his eyes, speaking slowly as the ideas fit themselves together in his mind.
"Vivian, I need you to get that big door open."
The siren glanced at him in confusion, not quite following the thread of his thoughts.
"What will that do?" "I mean, it might clear the air a little, but..."
She let out a shaky sigh, realizing what her lack of understanding probably meant.
"Oh, gee. This is one of your totally crazy Super Mario plans, isn't it?"
He held her by the shoulders, gently but firmly, needing her to see the certainty in his eyes.
"Do you trust me?"
he asked, to which she nodded without hesitation.
"Can you open the door?"
he continued, and she paused only briefly before nodding again.
"Then I trust you, too. I think we can beat her, but we have to get started right now."
They broke away with a final nod, going their separate ways just as their cover was toppled by the force of a falling credenza. Mario looked back in time to see Vivian vanish into the smoke, having total faith that she'd be able to navigate it safely. The hero reached up to adjust his cap, purely on reflex, and realized again that it wasn't there. Smiling to himself, he turned and dashed off to find a ladder. He skirted the edge of the metallic chamber, occasionally leaping across pits and glowing crevices that fell away to who knows where. To make things more stressful, he was still dodging death from above, because faux Vivian's arsenal just never seemed to run dry. Mario guessed that she was probably starting new fires around the palace, all for the sake of her twisted pursuit of validation. Eventually, he discovered what he had been searching for: a narrow set of iron rungs that jutted from the wall, leading up to the first level of docking stations. He jumped aboard and climbed swiftly, pausing at one point to shield his face as a table exploded overhead, showering the ladder with splinters and sparks. Once he had made it to the balcony, Mario had a perfect panoramic view of the smoky arena that lay below. Fireballs flared within the haze like lightning in a distant thunderhead, echoing with laughter and the sad crackling of antiques becoming ash. He could only guess where Vivian was in that mess, but it was a good few hundred yards from where she had started to where she needed to be. As he turned to resume his own mission, something snagged Mario's ankle so suddenly that he nearly tripped back over the edge.
It looks like someone's been sneaking out of bounds,
the siren taunted, her voice wafting up from the shadows at his feet.
That's against the rules. Get back down here so I can punish you.
Mario noticed how her voice hitched, uncomfortable with the word even as she said it herself. He kicked his way free from the shadowy claw, letting the darkness hiss in frustration as he sprinted off down the catwalk. More hands grabbed at him from the walls, so he strafed onto the nearest docking pad and began running along the hulls of the saucers themselves. They weren't the steadiest platforms, so it came as blessed relief when the pursuing shadows gave up and receded. Somewhere in the chaos below, Vivian must have saved him with a very timely distraction. Without further thought, Mario plopped into the ship he happened to be perched on, one of the tiny single-seat support saucers that were typically seen buzzing around the larger vessels like gnats. Truth be told, he had no idea how to pilot shroom tech, but he had flown many things throughout the years, from Pidgeot carpets to an asteroid shaped like his own head. How hard could it be to learn the basics? It took a few tense moments of fumbling, but Mario finally found the switch that brought the engines to life. He tilted the joystick to the side, hoping to lift gently away from the dock, but that promptly capsized the saucer and nearly sent the hero plummeting to his doom. Learning lessons on the fly, he managed to right the ship and find its stabilizer clutch, and with ragged breaths and clenched teeth, he was able to maneuver safely out into the open air. His first priority was to get far away from the walls, so he wasted no time in piloting up and out toward the center of the bay. The next step relied on Vivian, who was still nowhere to be seen.
I hope I sent her in the right direction,
Mario thought, leaning down to inspect the switch-labeled lasers.
If she's still searching, then maybe I can do something to buy her a little time.
Flipping the switch caused the ship to tremble, and Mario knew from experience that the bottom of the hull had opened to reveal a swiveling blaster-tipped arm. A targeting reticle appeared on a nearby screen, and Mario spun the joystick in search of a likely target. It was impossible to see either version of Vivian through the haze, and even if he could, he wasn't sure he'd be able to tell them apart at this height. Instead, he chose to focus on the bright fireballs as they appeared, since they likely marked the presence of a shadowy arm. Every time a new part of the cloud flared orange, he would blast it with lasers until the fires died and he heard a scream. If his strategy was working, then he was making the projectiles explode in his enemy's hands, hopefully causing some damage and keeping her attention focused on him. Of course, she eventually saw through the trick and began trying to counter it with a few of her own. Clusters of shadow erupted from the walls, but Mario evaded them simply by being out of range. Vertical fireballs threatened to pelt him out of the air, but he flew upwards until they arced harmlessly beneath him.
You can't reach me,
he called down, letting the words fall into the smoke like bait into a stream.
I'm away from the shadows, and you can't stretch this far. There's no way you can get up here.
And then there she was, emerging from the darkness on the highest balcony, staring across the divide with defiance in her bloodshot eyes.
You think you're safe just because you're flying?
She asked, her voice laced with more smugness than Mario had been expecting. Far below, the former battlefield lay utterly ignored, the fires fading as the smoke began to clear.
You still have no idea what I can do.
Without another word, she retreated backwards as her legion of spectral hands appeared. They came up through the balcony, bearing scraps of debris in every shape and size. metal torn from walls, slabs of charred wood, and fistfuls of miscellaneous junk pulled from the rooms downstairs. The hands laid their materials out over the pit, affixing each new object to the edge of the last, building outwards with the swift precision of an assembly line. The twisted siren glided across her bridge, casually keeping pace with the path as it formed ahead of her.
"It was a pretty clever plan,"
she called, giggling as Mario tried to inch his little ship backwards, evading the arm of wreckage as it crept ever closer.
"But you made a big mistake. I keep telling you, I'm nothing like your timid little girlfriend down there. I can do so many things that she just can't."
Mario glanced behind himself, checking to see if the big door had begun to open yet. It hadn't, but the opposite wall was getting dangerously close. If he kept backing up, then the enemy would be able to simply grab him from the sidelines.
"Come on, Vivian. I know you can do this,"
he thought, watching as a piece of timber extended the bridge by at least 10 feet.
"Any time, Viv. Any second now."
It happened right on cue, with a rush of cool air and a thundering Kansas thum that made the whole fleet tremble in their stations. The bay doors parted and began to slide away, revealing the ivory skyline of the palace beyond. For the first time, it was a sight that Mario was truly glad to see. He spun the saucer to face the opening, jammed the joystick in position, hit the throttle as hard as he could, and went nowhere, held in place by the knot of arms that had grabbed on at the very last second. They had shot from the end of the bridge, and now the saucer was screaming against its restraints as the shadows reeled it in.
"Why can't you just let me be better than her?"
Vivian snarled, glaring dangerously down at Mario as she finally reached the ship.
"She's weak and afraid, and she doesn't even know what she is. My life has been torture, so it should have made me stronger. There's nothing she can do that I can't do better."
Mario stood up with a patient smile, steadying his legs as the saucer revved uselessly beneath him.
"She can do plenty of things that you can't. She can make friends, and keep them, and be there for them when they need her. When she laughs, it's because she means it, and it sounds pretty, instead of creepy like yours."
As he spoke, he was becoming surer of his plan, and maybe some feelings he had that didn't entirely relate to said plan.
"Just face it, all you'll ever be is a shade of her."
Those words had the perfect effect, and the siren's whole face twitched as she surged up onto the saucer's hull. Mario held out a hand to stop her, climbing out of the cockpit with a sad shake of his head.
"But there's one thing she can't do, and I'm betting that you can't do it either."
She sought his eyes manically, almost desperately, waiting for him to clarify. He did so with a single word.
"Jump."
And that was it. Mario leapt into the air, somersaulting over his enemy as she glared up with a mix of confusion and dawning terror. He tucked his knees in at just the right moment, shifting his weight into a ground pound above the first weak link in the bridge. It instantly buckled as he slammed down, the impact making the slapdash structure sway, bend, and finally snap right through. The trapped saucer was freed, its controls still locked and its engines on full blast. Vivian shrieked in fury as it zoomed away, carrying her through the bay doors and away from the battle. She had been isolated, cut off from the shadows, and thus her entire arsenal, until the little ship finally landed. Mario watched it as he fell, keeping his eyes on the speck of silver until it vanished like a star on the horizon. But speaking of landings, he was running out of time to prepare for his own. Mario had crashed straight through the bridge, and now he was riding the debris back toward the dauntingly solid floor below. Most of the lingering smoke had spilled out through the open doorway, giving him a perfect view of the steel slab as it rushed forward to meet him. The hero shut his eyes, bent his knees, and braced for the inevitable impact. which never came, because he passed right through the floor and into the arms of his Vivian, who cushioned him with her body as they fell together through the void.
"We did it! That was incredible!"
she said, whirling him around in a moment of light-headed celebration. Mario smiled as she took a deep breath, free from her duplicate's strangling presence at last.
"She's totally gone. We're the only ones down here, and it feels great."
Her laughter was infectious, and he soon found himself chuckling alongside her, but something she had said was quite worrying.
"Wait, did you say we're alone in the shadows?"
he asked, pulling himself together as they twirled back to the surface together.
"But that can't be right. What about Luigi and Bao? Can't you sense them anywhere nearby?"
Vivian averted her gaze, chewing on her lower lip as she anxiously shook her head.
"I'm sorry, but I don't think they're down here anymore."
Mario didn't exactly know what that meant, but he trusted Vivian to be honest with him.
They could have escaped, or maybe Evil Me threw them out somewhere."
By somewhere, she probably meant that far-flung dungeon cell beneath the palace.
"I guess we won't be reuniting with them just yet,"
he sighed, pointing to the nearest hallway that led out of the bay.
"Let's hurry and get to the bridge, then. I bet the Empress is gonna make it there any minute now."
They emerged from the shadows and raced down the passage, following its twists and turns until it opened back into the main shaft. Unfortunately, they were far from alone in here. Hundreds of guards, perhaps the entire army, were fleeing downwards in a blind panic. They were stampeding down switchback staircases, tearing off their helmets to reveal the tear-streaked faces of toads. The mothership gave a mighty lurch, spilling soldiers over the railing and into the 100-story abyss below. Mario pulled a toad from the throng, searching for answers in the guard's beady black eyes.
"It's in the control room,"
the shroom cried, pulling away to rejoin the herd.
"That monster hijacked our ship. I saw it, Lieutenant Johnson."
As he fled, he shouted that familiar phrase that could have been a slogan for toadkind in general.
"We're all gonna die."
Just then, the spire jerked upwards with such intense force that Mario nearly fell to his knees. He braced himself against the wall as explosions sounded in the distance, growing louder and melding together into an ear-splitting roar. The whine of alarms cut through it all, echoing down the tunnel as the violet light darkened to a nightmarish, bloody shade of red.
"What's happening?"
Vivian asked, trying to keep steady by leaning against Mario's shoulder.
"Are we too late?"
With a final stone-shattering heave, the dreadnought finally broke free of the castle that had kept it grounded for so many years. Even as the ship began to rise, some of the toads kept on with their doomed descent, while others merely laid down where they stood, waiting to either be trampled or pushed over the edge. Mario looked back up the shaft, trying to find some hope in the darkness, but their destination was far away, and they were out of time.
"We need a new plan,"
he said, taking Vivian by the hand and leading her back the way they had come.
"The ship is taking off, and the invasion is about to begin."
Not too far away, Princess Peach was stuck in the great glass lift, watching as her captors raced in vain against the launch.
"Don't you wimp out on me now, Cammy!"
Bowser growled, stomping in agitated circles as the elevator descended.
"You used magic to get us up this tower, right? So just say the spell backwards and get us back down."
Outside the tube, it was plain to see how quickly they were being outpaced. The skyline was beginning to fall away again, the platform moving upwards with the ship even as it tried to descend. The witch sat a few feet away, concentrating on a far more sensible type of spell.
"I'm sorry, my lord,"
she croaked, glancing up only when the lift was perfectly stable,
"but it's taking all my magic just to keep us on course."
As she said it, the platform passed an enormous gap in the glass, shattered by the Empress soul as it had stormed up the spire.
You wouldn't want us to fly out because we went too fast, would you?
The princess stayed silent, her mind still reeling from all that had happened in the last few minutes. She had been bound on an altar, seconds away from being possessed, when Bowser of all people had come charging to the rescue. Then Kamek had said something about mushrooms, and Bowser had told everyone the truth about Peach's alternate self.
No, she was never my other self. She's been some hideous beast, hiding behind human skin since the very beginning.
The little wizard had said nothing, falling nearly catatonic as the truth seeped in. Bowser had poked him with a claw, trying to trigger the epic breakdown that he said should have happened. Finally, Kamek had managed to sputter out a breathless,
"For 20 years."
Before feebly raising his wand and warping away. The group hadn't seen him since. That had been nearly 15 minutes ago. Now they were back in the lift, because Bowser insisted on returning to the feast hall to fight the Empress personally. That genius plan had been derailed as soon as the tower began to move, nearly pitching the platform and its passengers out through the glass and into freefall. The plazas below had been consumed by blue-violet fire, billowing exhaust that incinerated the palace gardens in an instant. Heat and smoke flooded into the broken elevator shaft, giving Peach a lungful of soot each time she passed a gap in the glass. Bowser took notice when she began to cough, rounding on Cammy with an accusatory snarl.
"This ride is taking so long that Peach is getting carsick. Can't you just warp us to the bottom or something?"
Cammy peered back over the edge, whistling through her few remaining teeth as the spreading fire danced in her spectacle lenses.
"You're a braver Koopa than I am, to suggest warping into that mess."
Choosing her words carefully, she offered Bowser one last chance to be rational.
"Perhaps you would rather go back up, instead? Surely, with all this commotion, the Empress must already be inside the ship."
The Koopa King stopped his pacing to mull that over, glancing between the spaceship above and the ruined stadium below. Then he did something absolutely insane and unexpected, which is, to be fair, the only type of thing Peach ever expected Bowser to do. He leapt at the wall with a roar of pure frustration, digging into the steel with his claws as the platform left him behind.
"Fly the princess out of here on your broom, and keep her safe. I've still got business to take care of here."
Peach couldn't take the absurdity, snapping at the reptile as the space between them grew.
"That's it? You're just leaving us here, to go off and climb a building like some common Kong?"
Behind her, the force of the liftoff caused a white spire to crack apart, crumbling like smashed snow into the pit of purple flame.
"This situation is almost worse than the one you saved me from."
Bowser shook his head, a grim seriousness in his eyes that caught the princess off guard.
"You wouldn't understand, Peach. That psycho-alien wiped out my army to the last shell. She's gotta pay for that."
He kept barking orders over his shoulder as he climbed, his natural loudness keeping the words perfectly audible.
"Cammy, take her to the kitchens or something. I'll bet she needs a snack after the stuff she's been through." "Heck, I know I would."
He must be second-guessed the suggestion, because he immediately began yelling down restrictions.
"But don't you dare let her overeat, you hear me? We've both seen where that leads, and I'm not letting that happen to my Peach."
At the end, just before he rose too high to hear, he shouted out his promise to the princess.
"Don't worry, Peachy. Your cuddly old Bowser is comin' back for you."
Meanwhile, Cammy had finished conjuring up a broom with seating enough for two. Peach looked at the witch, then down at the fire, before finally slumping her shoulders and climbing aboard with a weary sigh.
"Oh, don't look so glum, princess,"
Cammy encouraged as they lifted off, flying high and leaving the spire behind.
"The two of us finally get some girl bonding time. If you behave, I might even share some of my beauty tips with you."
As they flew out over the palace, Peach tried stargazing for the first time in months. It wasn't because she felt like it, exactly. It was because, for the first time since she had come to this world, there was something up there to look at. The false stars were a chilling sight, spinning in rings that seemed almost too precise and synchronous to be the work of living pilots. Then, for one brief instant, she thought she saw the normal stars too. They were gone in less than a blink, but Peach knew what she had seen. The space between the rings had flickered like static, displaying the image of a sky where the stars still shone.
I'm just hallucinating from exhaustion. There's no way the sky could change like that, unless...
The truth came with such horrible swiftness that it nearly knocked her from the broom.
That's not an invasion fleet,
she realized, her blood running cold as she watched the ships carry out their ritual.
It's a gigantic portal between worlds. When it turns on, the Empress is aiming to fly her mothership straight through.
In that case, there really was no hope of stopping the invasion, was there? Only someone up amongst those ships, a hero with intelligence, determination, and quite a bit of luck, could possibly close that portal now. But honestly, what were the chances of that? Imagine the serenity of being near space, the feeling of drifting through the high atmosphere, safe in a shuttle pod, witnessing the true immensity of your planet for the very first time. Picture taking in the view, knowing that you would likely never see it again. Now imagine you had no idea how to fly that shuttle. You were smart enough to learn, maybe, but there were screaming mushrooms in the way, and also you had no arms.
We're all gonna die,
Toad started, but Goombella managed to shut him up by hopping onto his head. She hadn't actually meant to interrupt the little guy, but she had needed a stepladder to reach the controls, and he was the closest thing in the room. Yoshi had taken the pilot's seat, and was flipping switches at random in an effort to disable the autopilot. Or rather, whatever was in control, because the switch labeled autopilot was very clearly off. As it stood, this little ship had basically taken them prisoner. It had somehow launched by itself, not long after the party had wandered aboard. Now it was spinning through the sky above the Empress Palace, one spacecraft among hundreds in a silent heavenly dance.
Yeah, and it's the creepiest thing,
Goombella thought, peering through the window as the swarm swirled around her. Of all the vessels that she could see into, from saucers to battleships, not a single one of them had passengers.
It makes no sense. Why spend 2 decades building a fleet if you're just gonna make it do ballet?
Suddenly, the console's lights flashed green to the sound of a cheery jingle, and the shuttle dropped about 10 feet before stabilizing as Yoshi grabbed the controls.
Hey guys, I did it!
The dinosaur shouted, throwing Goombella off balance as Toad and Toadette rushed over to see.
If I'm careful, I might actually be able to land this thing safely.
He demonstrated his skills by pulling up, immediately crashing into the saucer that was passing overhead.
Inverted controls!
Goombella shrieked, falling to the ground as the saucer scraped its way across the hull.
You have to tilt the steering thingy up to go down. You've totally never flown a plane before, have you?
Yoshi followed her advice, breathing a sigh of relief as the ship pulled away without taking much damage.
Does strapping a hang glider to a go-kart count?
He asked, sheepishly scratching the side of his head.
Otherwise, I've spent my whole life on the ground. How do you know so much about this stuff, anyway?
Goombella shrugged, trying to peek at the controls again.
Mostly from video games, although I did fly Glitzville once. See, I was on vacation, but I got pulled into this heist, and...
The two toads snapped to attention, ready for a swashbuckling tale, but this just didn't seem like the time for that.
That's not important right now. What matters is getting us all out of here in one piece.
But was flying away really the best option? They were trying to stop the invasion, yeah? So maybe they were exactly where they needed to be.
Let's not land just yet,
she suggested, hurrying to think of a plan before Yoshi could object.
What if we stayed up here and, shot down the rest of the fleet?
Their little shuttle didn't have any guns, but larger vessel totally would.
This sounds crazy, but what if we tried to board that ship over there?
Pointing wasn't easy for a Goomba, but luckily she didn't need to. The spacecraft she meant was passing directly ahead, plain for all to see. It was a sleek and impressive combat frigate, which might have been silvery white beneath the choking layer of purple runes that glowed across its hull. There were similar vessels all over the place, plus a few that were even larger, but only this one had a visibly open shuttle bay. Evidently, some schmuck hadn't bothered to check the doors before launching the crewless ship. It was a sound decision, and everyone was anxious for a little extra legroom. Between Goombella's technical know-how and Yoshi's arm-having skills, the two of them managed to navigate the swarm with relative ease. At the very least, they were able to pull up behind the frigate without getting totally destroyed along the way. By the time the shuttle finally landed, Goombella felt like she had practically learned enough to get her Paragoomba license. The four heroes disembarked together, but as Yoshi and the toads stretched their legs, Goombella wandered the bay to try and learn its layout. It was fairly stark and empty, aside from their ship and a row of escape pod hatches lining the far wall. The arcane squiggles were sparser in here, although there were still enough to give the room a vaguely sinister vibe.
Let's find our way up front,
the Goomba girl urged, making her way to the nearest door and grinning as it audibly swished open for her.
We need to tear apart this fleet, before it does whatever it's up here to do.
The frigate wasn't terribly huge, although there did seem to be at least 3 or 4 decks to get lost in. The party made their way up a staircase and down a narrow hallway, listening to the engines and the subtle hum of magic.
How is this ship flying?
Toadette asked, clearly getting creeped out by the emptiness of this place.
All of those saucers out there, too. How would they take off without anyone inside them?
They're drones, Yoshi answered, because that's the only explanation that made any logical sense.
Nobody needs to be up here, because it's all being controlled from somewhere down there.
From a nearby window, the Empress Citadel could clearly be seen below them, spreading blue fire and shaking itself free of the surrounding palace.
No points for guessing where, though. That place is the brain of this whole invasion.
Toad instantly perked up at the mention of drones, recalling the time he had briefly flown a copter during the Star Festival.
Hey, that's perfect. We're drone experts, right Toadette?
That was a stretch, but Goombella didn't have the heart to say so, especially to her pink friend's face. After such an intense night, the girl deserved a fun little fantasy.
Come on, let's go take over the fleet. It'll be awesome.
They ran off hand in hand, racing down a side hallway in search of adventure. Yoshi looked half tempted to reel them in, but he had been doing that all night, and his exhaustion finally seemed to win out.
They can go play around for a while. We'll pick them up when it's time to leave.
Meanwhile, Goombella was still staring out the window, hypnotized by the nightmarish scene unfolding underneath her. The grand launch was fully underway, and the dreadnought's ponderous ascent seemed to be utterly decimating the palace around it. At the fore of it all sat the brilliant sphere of the Star, a shining figurehead, and a promise of the devastation the ship was bringing with it to the other world. She sadly wondered what had become of her friends. Were they still alive in the madness down there? Had Mario rescued that prissy princess that he seemed to care so much about? Was Vivian still in her weird funk, or had she broken out of her shell and finally admitted her feelings? Hey, Goombella was a smart gal. She knew when someone had the love bug, and she had been rooting for the siren since the very start. But this was no time to be getting lost in gossip. For all she knew, her friends had been wiped out by the STARS light, and now the fate of two worlds rested on her and Yoshi alone. She hurried forward, catching up with the dinosaur just as he found the bridge, a streamlined chamber located right at the ship's bow. The room was a wide half-oval, lined with the typical monitors and blinking panels, all nestled beneath a panoramic view screen that captured the entire horizon. The Goomba waddled over to the nearest station, hoping to learn its function by scanning the text on nearby monitors. She didn't see anything about steering or weapons, so she sidled down the line to keep reading. Suddenly, the main screen flickered with what looked like shining snow, but the effect was already gone by the time Goombella turned to look. She was about to chalk it up to a glitch in the display, until Yoshi gasped and ran to look out a window.
Wait, did I just see a bunch of stars outside?
Goombella stumbled over to join her friend, the mission temporarily forgotten as she strained her eyes against the empty sky. She didn't understand, and she scarcely dared to believe, but if Yoshi was right, then she may have just seen natural starlight for the very first time.
I've heard so many stories,
she whispered, glancing back at the view screen with bated breath.
This is so far beyond insane. Do you think it'll happen again?
As if in answer, the spaceship gave a violent shudder and suddenly picked up speed. The runes on the hull ignited like firecrackers, turning the frigate into a violet comet as the ambient humming pitched up to a scream. Outside, the other ships were undergoing the same transformation, and in mere seconds, the cosmic dance had dissolved into a frenzy. As the swarm blurred together into a fiery smear, a pale mist began spreading out across the inner expanse. It seeped and flowed between the rings like a high tide of moonlight, and when the currents met at the very center, they birthed a pulse of magic that lit the sky with another world's stars. Yoshi pushed away from the window, opting to watch the convergence play out on the big screen.
I think we figured out why the fleet is here, Goombella. It's opening up a portal to my timeline.
The structured rings fell apart as each vessel went its own way, skimming between the two realities like pebbles skipping across the surface of a misty pond. The hero's false comet soared up through the shroud, bathed for an instant in the light of a waxing moon. Then it was sinking again, diving into the darkness of a long-forsaken sky. Goombella stood beside the window, transfixed by glimpses of a cosmos more beautiful than she had ever imagined.
Rolf wouldn't have believed this,
she muttered, wishing more than anything that the Thugan could be here with her right now. But sadly, even in the presence of so many stars, some wishes just couldn't come true.
I had no idea there were so many of them. Is this how your world looks like, all the time?
She gazed past her reflection in the glass, out to where the tiny lights twinkled by the thousands.
Actually, this isn't really that many,
Yoshi admitted apologetically, hating that he had to dampen the experience.
You can see way more of them if you're out in the countryside. We're right over my world's version of Mushroom City, so a lot of the starlight is lost to light pollution.
Goombella gasped, standing on tiptoes to see down over the sill. She had been so entranced by the stars that she had totally forgotten the world below. Sure enough, there was a misty sea of skyscrapers down there, bustling and vibrant even this late into the night. The vision was gone a moment later, replaced by empty wasteland and the still oncoming mothership.
This portal is opening right above downtown,
she realized, the implications making her stomach turn.
The Empress is gonna destroy the city all over again.
At once, the tranquility was shattered, and Goombella raced back to the helm, determined to stop that tragedy by any means necessary. She had no plan, but she had never liked relying on those dumb things anyway.
Yoshi, Do whatever you did before to gain control, she commanded, to which he began flipping random switches again. We don't stand a chance up here, unless we can sever the link with the mothership. But hijacking a starship was no simple task, and the Goomba girl was soon feeling overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of the room. Buttons and dials blinked up at her from every interface, cheerily mocking her ignorance. Ugh, come on. I'm totally smart enough to figure this out. I mean, it's only rocket science. Despite her forced optimism, she just felt like slamming her head on the nearest keyboard. I bet that smarty-pants other Goombella could have solved this in a heartbeat. She felt like screaming at herself. This was no time to be getting jealous of a person she had never met. I'm the Goombella the world is stuck with tonight, she thought, nudging an array of levers to no visible effect. Overhead, the Vuskrison's image was still wavering between the city and the mechanical terror coming to wipe it out. I can handle this. That whole city is counting on me. I just need to keep trying. And then the systems shut down. All around the bridge, screens and panels winked to blackness as if someone had just tripped over a power cord. Goombella turned to Yoshi, her eyes wide and horrified, only to find him looking back with the same expression. Far away, the steady drone of the engines gave way to silence, and the ecstatic chattering of two incoming young toads. They burst into the room, all smiles and slightly out of breath. Guys, we did it! Toad shouted, proudly holding up two fistfuls of shredded wiring. Beside him, Toadette was holding an odd device encased in a half-shattered glass ball. You should have seen us. It was just like that one episode of Toad Force V, when Jack and Brittany sneak aboard the Death Spore to rescue. What did you do? Goombella interrupted, running to the little window since the main screen was dead. Their ship had begun to drift, sinking far below the misty portal and leaving the stars behind. Suddenly, the craft pitched forward with a tired metallic groan and began to fall. Guys, what did you do? Toadette slid into the chamber, dropping her mystery sphere as she hurried to grab onto the doorframe. The ball rolled down the tilting floor, bouncing a few times before exploding against the back of a workstation. We found the receiver. The one that was getting all the signals from the mothership, she explained, looking marginally less proud than her partner. Also, we kind of turned off the entire ship. Yoshi had gone bug-eyed, sputtering incoherently as he scrambled up to join the group. Why? He finally managed, although Toad didn't seem to understand the issue until the floor dropped, and everyone fell about 2 feet. We needed this ship. Now we're just standing around talking as it's going down. Guilt and realization flashed across Toad's face as he finally noticed the pull of gravity. But I just wanted to look cool, he muttered, dropping his wires and glancing back up the hallway. A pile of boxes collapsed in a neighboring storeroom, finally spooking the mushroom into action. We've gotta get out of here. The heroes climbed back into the passage, beginning their long journey back toward the shuttle bay and escape. The first few steps were agony, because they were struggling against the constantly increasing slant of the floor. Yoshi pushed to the front of the group, looking ready to try grappling onto the walls with his tongue. Mercifully, the ship began to level out, tilting back to normal as the outside air pressure changed. They ran the length of one hallway on blessedly stable ground, until the vessel began to pitch back the other way. When Goombella and the others descended to the next deck, they found themselves slipping and sliding, fighting to stay upright, lest they fall to the back of the ship instead. They barely made it into the right stairway, and Yoshi did.
end up having to grapple the wall to keep himself from tumbling past. Sadly, gravity was affecting more than just their own bodies. They made it to the shuttle bay just in time to see their getaway craft slide back and out through the doorway, falling like a stone as air resistance caught the frigate yet again. This time, the ship soon rocked up into a genuine nosedive, and the party was left scrambling along the walls.
"Everybody, into the escape pods!"
Yoshi yelled, hauling himself up to the nearest hatch and fiddling with the adjacent panel until it swished open. He clambered inside, then leaned back to assist the others, snaring them one by one until everyone was snugly inside the pod. As it turned out, it was just large enough to fit them all, although they were packed together more tightly than bullet bills in a blaster.
"I have no idea where this thing will land, but let's hope it's nicer than here."
The next thing Goombella knew, it was too late to turn back. The hatch had slid shut, and the tiny chamber was being discharged into the open sky.
"What have we done?"
she wondered, watching as the spaceship plummeted away from her, falling like a spear. Right into the path of the oncoming dreadnought.
"Hey, guys,"
Toad said, lifting up his phone to record a video.
"This is gonna be so awesome!"
At that moment, Luigi was wheezing himself awake at the tip of an ivory spire. As luck would have it, he was just in time to see it all happen. The first thing he felt was the slap of Lady Bo's fan, followed by her spectral chill as she tried to shake him by the shoulders.
"Get up, you lazybones! How many times is this going to happen? I swear, your brother never passed out like this during our first adventure."
As Luigi struggled to his feet, coughing all the while, she watched him closely with thinly veiled concern.
"But then again, I didn't have to save you outright this time, so I suppose that's an improvement."
He gave her a wan smile, recalling how they had ended up here. Back down in the shadows, Bao had phased free of the tendrils as soon as she had regained her wits. She had flown towards the sound of someone thrashing, who had turned out to be Luigi. He had still had his fire flower, so he had been able to burn away his own restraints once he had gotten an arm free. Together, the hero and the ghost had raised such a ruckus that their enemy had given up and flung them out of the void on her own. Unfortunately, she seemed to have flung them quite far afield, and without even bothering to aim. Luigi had barely gained his balance before he looked down and promptly lost it again. Somehow, the shadows had ejected him halfway across the palace, 70 stories high on a narrow marble precipice. The white city spiraled away beneath him, its streets and courtyards mere background imagery for a chasm that might as well have been bottomless.
"You didn't see this as something I should know?"
he shouted, pressing himself back against the wall as Bao hovered innocently above the abyss. He glanced left and right, hoping to spy some other ledge that was safer to stand on. There were a few stone bridges passing nearby, part of the great web that ran between the spires, but the nearest looked to be over 30 feet away and 2 stories down. For anyone else, it would be hopelessly out of reach, but Luigi... well, he was a Mario brother, after all. After backing up until he felt his heel nearly slip over the edge, Luigi sprinted forward and vaulted off the precipice. He sailed through the air in a perfect arc, and if anything, he very nearly overshot his destination.
"All right, now to get back to the Citadel and find my bro,"
he thought, tripping only slightly as he landed. But the plan never got any further than that, because when he looked up, his eyes met a sight so terrifying that he nearly blacked out all over again. Where the central spire should have been, there was now only thick smoke and a pillar of azure flame. Luigi followed the fire up into the night, to where the colossal mothership had ascended halfway to the stratosphere. The vengeful blaze of its aura consumed everything. It split apart the heavens like an executioner's axe, and the surrounding darkness died screaming. Even now, the Stardust engine could be seen at the apex, gleaming as golden as a stolen sunrise. Staring at it hurt Luigi's eyes, so he glanced up a little higher, into the untouched blackness beyond. That's when he saw the tiny shape hurtling down, a silver bullet from out of the orbital fleet. It seemed to be some kind of shuttlecraft, locked on a collision course with fate. It struck the STAR head-on, vaporizing the glass sphere with meteoric force. In an instant, the shimmering machine went supernova, exploding with the megaton might of an overcharged galaxy reactor. Plumes of hoarded stardust erupted sideways into the sky, mingling and mixing above the palace into low-hanging nebulas of white and gold. The obscene strength of the explosion was enough to push the mothership entirely off course. The dreadnought's bow, lost within a stellar fireball, drifted helplessly to one side as the rear engines continued to thrust. The spire's lower half soon caught up with and overtook the upper, tracing a ring of blue fire through the darkness as the ship pushed itself into the beginnings of a spiral. Which is when the second spacecraft came screaming out of the sky. A battleship, trapped in a nosedive and trailing a comet's tail of violet magic. It pierced the mothership's exposed hull straight through, crashing and burning deep into the Colossus' hidden heart. It must have detonated fiercely in there, because there were only a few heartbeats of silence before explosions were spreading across the ship in waves. The engines failed, the exhaust guttered out, and then the mighty spire was falling. It plummeted back into the chaos of its own fiery trail, still barely visible by the red glow of its desperately flaring aura. But then the curtains of smoke descended, and that baleful light faded from view for the very last time. All that remained were the horrific grinding explosions, the shrieks and moans of twisting metal, and the single grand shockwave as the ship finally blew itself to smithereens on impact with the ground. Luigi just stared at the horizon for a while, watching the smoke rise and curl against the layer of stardust clouds. Bao floated up beside him, silent and slack-jawed.
It blew up.
She attempted lamely, but didn't make it any further. For once in her unlife, she was truly at a loss for words. The hero pulled himself together, hoping to find some hidden pocket of courage amidst his scattered thoughts. He leaned out over the bridge's railing, trying to get the best possible view of the distant carnage.
Was anyone we know still in there? Mario, Vivian, Princess Peach.
He trailed off, not daring to let his imagination press any further.
Let's hurry and find a way back over there. They might really need our help.
In spite of his firm words, Luigi found it difficult to take another step. Something new and strange was happening on the horizon, and a laughing little voice at the back of his mind was bidding him to stay and watch the show. It was still impossible to see anything through the smog, but the noises from beyond were utterly chilling. The sound of explosions had given way to the rumble of collapsing stone, the echo of arcane thunder, and something else. A kind of low yawning gasp, unceasing, esurient, and oh so vaguely familiar.
Look out!
Bao yelled, snapping Luigi back to reality just in time for him to hear the wail of an incoming projectile. He instinctively leapt backwards, narrowly evading the shrub saucer that plowed through the spot where he had just been standing. He leaned out to watch the wreckage plummet into the chasm, only to see two more vessels strike the sides of neighboring spires.
I'd be looking up if I were you, Greenie. This is the most vile meteor shower I've ever seen.
So Luigi turned his gaze skyward, whimpering pitifully in the face of what he saw up there. The entire fleet was hailing down, the false stars blazing from re-entry and still coursing with unstable dark magic.
They were being controlled by the mothership.
He realized, watching a mangled frigate blow apart one spire as its wing flew loose and beheaded another.
Now that it's been taken out, there's nothing keeping them airborne.
Compared to this, that night at Peach's gala didn't seem quite so terrifying anymore. He started running, following the bridge away from the madness as fast as his legs could carry him. If the entire swarm was collapsing out of the sky, then there was no safe place inside the palace to hide. His only hope was to reach the gates and escape, but that would soon prove easier said than done. Saucers impacted the bridge and the nearby towers, obliterating the path ahead, and Luigi found himself leaping across the void to find safety on another strand of the web.
"Isn't there anything you can do to help?"
he panted, turning to Lady Bow as she sped along beside him. He couldn't believe that he was actually putting his life in the hands of a boo, but then again, he couldn't believe a lot of things that were happening right now.
"Can't you turn us both intangible, like you did before?"
She shook her head. Well, her entire self. Frantically, flying a little faster in hopes that Luigi would match the pace.
"I can hide you, but I'm not strong enough to carry you,"
she warned, phasing to avoid a saucer as Luigi side somersaulted out of its way.
"If the bridge we're on collapses, then you're going to fall no matter what I do."
Even as she said it, the remains of an uprooted spire fell across the horizon, shattering a great gash through the network of pathways ahead. Luigi scrambled up over the side of his bridge, falling onto a new viaduct that managed to pass unscathed around the chasm. But as he fell, he got his first good look at the distant ground. Or rather, at the churning vacuum that had begun to tear it apart. The enchanted comets hadn't just been leaving behind craters. As they struck the surface, the ships were rupturing into the pure essence of their half-finished spell. Luigi recalled the words of Kami Koopa, when she had described the fallen stars as portal bombs. She had been right yet again, because malformed dimensional gateways were tearing themselves open in the streets, lunar white at their smallest, but darkening in shade to violet and black as the vortexes met and merged together. This was no time to stop and gawk, though, because some unseen battleship had just smashed through the bridge a few hundred feet behind where Luigi had landed. He clambered upright, running full tilt as he tried to keep ahead of the splintering stonework beneath his feet. Just as the bridge began to crumble underfoot, he spied a balcony jutting from the window of a nearby spire. The gap was wider than any he had ever jumped, but there was no time to wait for a safer opportunity. Sucking in his breath and wishing Mario were here to see this, he bounded once to get ahead of the collapse, then again onto the high marble railing, and finally a third time into the emptiness of open air. His triple leap of faith almost carried him across the divide, but instead he slammed into the side of the balcony, and had to hectically claw his way back up onto solid ground. When Bao finally caught up with him, Luigi could barely do more than roll onto his back and stare up into space. Which turned out to be an awful idea, because it left him staring down a meteor that was too vast and close to possibly be escaped. The thing was a metallic junk heap the size of Peach's castle, and now it was bearing down on this remote tower like the vengeful fist of the heavens themselves. In a situation like this, Luigi couldn't think of anything to do except shut his eyes and plead incoherently for a miracle. He may have been given one, because half a minute passed and he was somehow still breathing. When he finally summoned the nerve to open his eyes, he saw the wreckage hanging motionless in midair, wrapped snugly within a sizzling energy shield. The barrier lifted its catch lightly, perhaps carelessly, before tossing it aside to let it crash through a neighboring spire and into the plazas below. Luigi wanted to feel relieved, but the nature of that spell had set him instantly on edge. He traced the wispy trail of magic back to its source, a familiar cloaked Magic Koopa, perched on a window ledge not far from the balcony. Kamek turned to survey his guests, his voice strained and his expression blank.
"I take it things aren't going well back at the Citadel."
It would have been funny if it hadn't sounded so absolutely pathetic.
"That evil thing has been taken down,"
Luigi said, trying to sound like he had some idea how it had happened. He pointed away from the spire, to where saucers were still throwing themselves into the swelling amalgamate of rifts and wormholes.
"The issue now is your portal spell." It's tearing apart the entire palace.
Kamek adjusted his glasses and scanned the horizon, noticing the world beyond his own tower for the first time in a while.
So it is,
he replied, as nonchalantly as if he had learned that it was raining outside.
You know, chaos magic doesn't tend to subside on its own. I imagine the rift will keep growing until it eats everything you see out there.
Lady Bao floated over to speak with the wizard heart to heart.
So, come and help us stop it,
she encouraged, trying hard to feign a patient smile.
After everything you've done, this is your one chance at redemption.
Together, they looked out over the crumbling ruins that had once been so regal and imposing.
Obviously, this wretched palace isn't worth saving, but what if these portals have breached the other side? They might be wreaking havoc in Mushroom City over there.
For one beautiful, hopeful second, Kamek seemed to genuinely consider the offer. But then he turned away, chuckling darkly to himself as he fled back into his chambers.
Nah, let it all get swept away,
he rasped over the noise of fluttering books and slamming trunks. Evidently, the wizard was packing his belongings for a hasty retreat.
Everything I built here, everything I helped her achieve, it was all based on a lie.
Luigi's mind was lagging behind, still stunned by something the mage had said earlier. He turned back to the abyss, placing a shaky hand on the balcony railing as he watched the portals fuse and darken. He had known something was familiar about them, but the truth didn't dawn until a distant plaza fully imploded into a raging violet-black maelstrom, laced with white hairline fractures in reality.
What kind of magic did you say this was?
He called back over his shoulder, but the mage only returned a derisive cackle. Far away, the vortex had already spread to engulf a few of the smaller portals at its edge. They were only going to keep feeding each other, increasing their instability with each fusion.
Is this another Tribe of Darkness technique? What kind of book did you learn it from?
Bao returned to his side with none of her usual breeziness, her eyes tinged with vague worry.
Luigi dear, are you all right? Your skin has gone as pale as mine.
She settled beside him on the railing, and together they watched the mighty skyline fall.
What about this Tribe of Darkness has gotten you so worked up? I've seen their magic before,
he answered, gazing out into the heart of oblivion. This wasn't the void, but it was the same spell in miniature, linked to two worlds instead of a trillion. From where Luigi was standing, that thought didn't make him feel any safer at all.
It's going to keep spreading, growing larger and hungrier.
He paused there, long enough to take a deep, shuddering breath.
Until it completely devours both timelines.
Let it never be said that Bowser wasn't built for skydiving. He had ridden that exploding monstrosity down from space like a champ. For most folks, being stuck to that spire would have meant certain and instantaneous death, but for the mighty Koopa King, it had been just another collapsing lair. He had dug his claws in and endured until the hull had broken apart, and then he had clung to the scraps until even they had failed on him. By that point, the fall was short enough to survive by simply retreating into his shell and letting the rebel carry him down. The escape from the blast zone had been trivial. He had struck the ground at an angle, and being a shell-bound Koopa, that meant he had been long gone by the time the hammer had fallen. He had been sent careening off down a side street, and must be been at least a mile away when he finally skidded to a halt. It was the kind of climactic escape that nobody would believe, but he had pulled it off without lifting a finger. But of course, the pandemonium had only just begun. Bowser had no idea how much time had truly passed, but he had spent what felt like an eternity playing dodgeball with these stupid UFOs.
Evacuating Peach was the right call,
he thought, managing to snipe a saucer out of the sky with his fire breath.
But now I have to find her again, before I run out of ground to stand on.
Every time a ship smashed into the pavement, it would leave behind a creepy little wormhole. As the portals piled up, it meant less room for the huge kupa to maneuver, and a gradual retreat towards the palace outskirts. It wasn't easy keeping an eye on the terrain and the sky. Even now, a careless step had nearly sent him tumbling backwards into a whirlpool of dark magic. It spanned the entire street, too, so Bowser growled and set off in a new direction. As he charged ahead, he turned to watch the smoke rising from the mothership's crash site. If he was being honest, there was something about the wreckage that called to him. He was sorely tempted to make his way back there and look around. Who knows? Maybe he could salvage some sweet alien technology to add to his arsenal back home. Just then, a saucer went hurtling straight past Bowser's head, knocking him aside as it skidded down onto the pavement. It had come whizzing right out of his blind spot, and by the time he saw it clearly, it had already plowed pitifully into a street corner lamppost. He trudged over to investigate, because there was clearly something strange about this particular ship. For one thing, it wasn't glowing purple, and for another, it hadn't yet spawned a swirly pit of death. As he approached, a figure emerged from the cockpit, and who else would it be but Mario? The little red nuisance staggered backwards down the hull, still getting his bearings back.
"Mamma mia, what a landing,"
he muttered, before extending a hand to help someone else out of the wreck.
"Are you feeling okay, Viv?"
The passenger turned out to be that purple girl who said she wasn't a ghost.
"I'm still fine,"
she answered, looking airsick but otherwise unharmed.
But what about you? I was hiding in your shadow the whole time. You're the one who actually felt everything."
Mario looked himself over, and then took an experimental hop onto the sidewalk.
"Me? I'm still in one piece,"
he joked, but grew solemn when he saw the saucer again.
"So much for my plan, though. Instead of hitching a ride to the bridge in style, we barely made it out of there alive."
The purple girl laced her fingers with his, and suddenly he was all smiles again. Bowser noticed how the two of them were fawning over each other, and wondered if they had some kind of secret thing going on. It was a strange notion. He had always pegged Mario as the desperate type, who would keep trying to get with Peach no matter what the princess said. Maybe he had some oddly specific pink fetish, and liked this new girl because of her hair? Before he could ruin their moment, his attention was grabbed by the sound of an utterly tremendous explosion. Everyone spun in the direction of the great ship's crash site, just in time to witness the night's newest dreadful surprise. Shrapnel and rubble were being flung from the wreckage, thrown by the tendrils of some thrashing shape within the smoke. The silhouette shrieked and wailed like a wounded animal as it tore its way loose from the ship, then unfurled and billowed down the hull towards the nearest still-standing spire. As it latched on and began to climb, Bowser got his first glimpse of its weeping crimson eyes. The eldritch beast ascended the tower, grappling its way up the marble surface with tentacles half-charred from the crash.
"Huh, so my hunch was right after all,"
Bowser said, watching the alien empress move closer to her unknown goal.
"She's even grosser and uglier than how I imagined her."
To make matters worse, she was far larger than he had imagined, as well.
"Do you remember the shroom that possessed you that one time?"
Mario asked, crossing the street to stand beside Bowser. His girlfriend tagged along, and together the three of them looked out over the end of the world.
"Well, that monster out there is her mother, if that tells you what we're up against."
The Koopa King raised an eyebrow and grunted, the memory of that old battle making his stomach turn. By now, Empress Shroom had reached the tip of her spire, and now seemed to be stretching herself even higher into the night. Bowser had half expected her to climb up there, roar dramatically in anguish one last time, and then topple off to her death. But no such luck. Her motive was something far more twisted and diabolical. something that Bowser wished he had thought of first. She stretched herself up into one of the low-hanging clouds of stardust, which had settled like a golden mist above the palace. As she inhaled, her grievous burns began to heal, and then slowly, surely, she began to glow golden herself. Her spreading hyphae flared with stellar fire, and a crown of fin-like spines seemed to form upon her head. She had immersed herself in pure star power, and it had transformed her into something beautiful and terrible to behold.
That was all dust from the reactor, right?
The shadow girl asked, her voice one shade above a whisper.
Does that mean she just powered up with the essence of the people she killed?
It was a sobering thought, the kind that Bowser hated to have weighing on his mind. If there had been some remnant of the transmuted people in that starlight, then what had just become of them? Bowser shook the questions away, instead focusing on something he could be personally angry about.
More importantly, she used the essence of the stars she stole from me. That's my power she's messing with.
It may or may not have been true, but it was reason enough for him to join the fight. Mario spoke up last, ever the voice of determination.
I doubt that her plan ends here. Whatever she wants, she powered up for some reason.
He stepped out in front of the group, facing the pair of ragtag companions that fate had given him this night.
And the three of us are going to stop her.
The Koopa King didn't object. He had bone to pick with that alien monster, and if smashing her meant working with Mario for a little while longer, then so be it. He stared up into the stardust, watching it spin and spread across the sky.
A swirling nebula of lost souls, You can't ask for a more perfect backdrop for an awesome final battle.
Below, the ground heaved with ancient magic. Above, the heavens churned with new starlight. And in between, the battle for the fate of two worlds began. End of chapter.